So, Kimi, what did you want to say?
I had a question regarding racelessness, the theory of racelessness. Dr. Sheena, like, what is the difference between taking a colorblind approach versus racelessness? Because I also just want to address the fact that Johann Blumenbach's definitions of race are not what we necessarily identify with today. And I could read those out. That's Caucasian, Mongolian, Malayan, Ethiopian, and American. And those are not necessarily the labels that we use. So I'm just curious to know, like, I believe we're already kind of on a slope away from those human distinctions. So what is the difference between the theory of racelessness and colorblindness?
Well, I think it's unfortunate, and I think this is kind of to Steve's point. It's unfortunate that colorblindness has taken such a negative stigma, right? Because these ultimately, we're talking about usually well-intentioned people who are, I think, operating from a place of not trying to support their own potential biases or other people's biases, but then getting caught in the quagmire of making it seem like they're not recognizing differences, they're ignoring differences, and all this other stuff. So I say that to say that in that way, I understand your question to be asking me, how is my theory, I didn't invent it, this theory like exists already, right? How is it different from colorblindness in a very particular way, in that many people associate colorblindness with ignoring racism? I think that that has become the sort of central pushback against dialogue that uses the word colorblindness, or even in this instance, racelessness. It's this idea that some people who profess to be colorblind are also intentionally or otherwise ignoring or sort of like refusing to acknowledge the existence and persistence of racism. So in that way, I draw a clear delineation between what I am advocating for, what I'm saying, my ideas, all of that stuff, from that sort of problematic spice flavor of colorblindness. But outside of that very important distinction, I don't know that it's different. I think it hits differently because colorblindness, Coleman Hughes said something eloquent probably a year ago in a talk. It gets this sort of faulty assumption that people are talking about literally not perceiving differences, not perceiving skin color, not perceiving what is thought to be race. But the ironic thing is, as Dr. Carter was kind of mentioning earlier, in a society that racializes people, that racialization is nefarious and it enacts violence onto people. The violence is that of racism. And so the theory of racism is not about let's pretend that people aren't different. Actually, it's about elevating and privileging the fact that people are different. That people are different, that skin tone, skin color does not signify sameness in culture, in linguistics, religion, nationality, like any of that, that we are actually different. In race, the concept, the language of race, being racialized really prevents in a lot of problematic ways the recognition of actual differences, and I'll say actual similarities, in ways that at this juncture, centuries into the mix, to me seems less practical for us to try to undo all of that and make it so it's not so. And it seems actually more practical to work toward elimination, not in a utopic way. I love that Khadija used the word utopic earlier. That's not what Dr. Carter and us eliminativists, that's not what we're advocating for. We recognize that there's going to be hierarchy, that we cannot get people in any population to 100% agree about any topic, much less this particular topic, right? But I think that we can definitely aim for the statistical majority, and we're not starting at zero. There are more people who are thinking along the lines of Dr. Carter and I, both historically and today, who are aligned with this idea of working toward a raceless society because of their foundational understanding of what race is in society, how it connects to racism and that sort of thing. So I hope that answers your question, Kimi. And I'm glad you asked the question because it's an important distinction, because there is a distinction.
Mm-hmm. And I love that we clarified that, because that was going to be a question down the line. Since we're on colorblindness, I'm just going to ask this question out because I'm loving this conversation right now. And then Sam, I'm going to get to you. But so we just heard what Dr. Sheena said. Does anyone else have any other commentary on colorblindness? Do you think colorblindness is wrong? Do you think colorblindness is right? Okay. Steve? Okay.
Yeah, so.
Oh, hold on. Oh, you're there. Okay, go ahead.
Yep. So I think Dr. Mason really touched on something that I didn't, that I really want to make clear too, is that in no way, shape, or form does the view of being colorblind in any way give you escape from culpability of complicity. So you don't get to make the excuse that you just didn't read it. I mean, there's thousands of books on, on the Black experience. I went to school. I never learned about W.E.B. Du Bois. I just barely read him last year, and I'm 44 years old. Right. So I've got a lot of making up to do. Just because you don't see color does not mean that you are not responsible for searching out institutions of racism and destroying them. So I don't want anybody to misunderstand when I say I don't see color as being an excuse not to see racism. And I think that's an incredibly valid point. And I'm grateful that you brought that up.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually going to chime in on this because, and I definitely, I think with the conversation that Coleman Hughes and I had, I think it was last year, and we've had other talks, definitely liked his point about, color blindness isn't about not seeing color. Like, we all can see color. When people tell me like they're colorblind or they don't see race, I know they don't mean they don't see my brown skin. Like, I know they don't say that. But I think the claim to me, in a sense, might be automatically false because it's like you see it, but why are you denying seeing it is my question. But you guys really fleshed it out for me. Though I think when people are saying that I don't see, when people say I'm not colorblind, to me, what I'm hearing is I don't see the implicit biases attached to your skin color or your race, or I don't believe the implicit biases attached to your skin color or race. And I think there's a difference between saying see and believe, because the latter implies you acknowledge it and you're actively not going to judge me or whoever else upon stereotypes or biases. So that's my take. It's a tricky thing because I've had tons of conversations with people in good faith, and they'll say that, and I know they mean it in a positive way, and I just take it kind of as a positive thing because I know what they mean. But other people that I have conversations with utilize that phrase to completely dismiss conversations on race. So that's why it's sometimes hard to know people's intent behind when they use it. So that's my take on colorblindness. Does anyone else have something else? Okay, we're going to have Samuel. He has something that he wants to say about the debate, and then we're going to bring in Dr. Carter. He has something else he wants to say.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the debate and this conversation. I've not finished the debate yet. It's 3 hours long, so I've not gone through yet, but I'm really enjoying it. I mentioned that because you guys disagree, but you disagreed very well, and I really appreciate that. On these issues it's usually very contentious and it leads to a lot of animosity, and I really appreciate it. And even in this conversation, I've heard a lot of things that I agree with and a lot of things that I disagree with, but yet I love that, right? And I almost want to just kind of sit back and grab a beer and just enjoy this thing. So that's really, again, I will share some of my thoughts later, but I just wanted to mention that as I'm grateful that I get to participate in this conversation.
Awesome, thank you. Dr. Carter?
Yes, just quickly, I would add about the colorblindness debate. Colorblindness, as I understand it, is a psychological justificatory mechanism for white liberalism. Right. This is why we have such difficulty with the concept. Right. So colorblindness, like you've already said, you know immediately that when a person says that, or that that's what they are, that they don't mean that they don't see your color. And probably you disbelieve them even if they want to suggest that it means that they don't see your race or ethnic makeup. Right. Because here's one thing about racism. Race is an ambient phenomenon. It's literally in the air. Right. We exist in a racial and a racialized medium. For particularly in the context of the United States, for a person to say that they don't see race would be like a person saying, I don't understand what a stop sign means. I mean, we exist in a racialized social context. You understand the meaning of race the same way you understand the meaning of Mississippi or Connecticut. Like, those are states. They've got geographic boundaries that have been codified by laws and other human edicts, right? You understand what it is we're talking about when we say these things, right? And the reason why we get into these conceptual difficulties with something like colorblindness is because we don't recognize that what it's really there for. It's there as a way to give psychological ease to a liberal white consciousness that's guilty about its complicity in a racialized social order. I don't want to keep yammering on, so I'll just.
I was like, that's a mic drop moment, but I was like, I'm not cutting it off. I mean, let's keep going.
Sorry if you don't mind, Doctor. Would you mind repeating that again? I know it was a mic drop, but I want to hear it again so I can fully understand what you're saying.
Yeah. So what I'm suggesting is that what colorblindness is a psychological coping mechanism for liberal white guilt. Right. It's a way for me to be able to say, I'm not complicit in systemic structures of racism because I don't see color. What do you mean by that? You can't see this? Of course you do. Well, what do you mean? You don't understand that I'm a person who's racialized as black? Well, that's got definite meanings, right? I'm ascribed to and codified in a society that marks me out as a fitting victim for a police officer to shoot to death, for instance, when I've committed no crime without legal ramification, right? It means something tangible, something significant to be racialized in a social context. And that socialization is something that everyone who exists in that context is knowledgeable of. Racism is something that we learn. We teach it to people. You cannot exist in the context of the United States and not have or come to an understanding of race. Right? And so it is a way of denying what they're complicit in.
But I think the reason why I guess I asked that, and I guess I would respond to that with a question, which is, if someone like me, a black man, were to say that I am colorblind, what would be your interpretation of what I just said?
I don't understand what you mean. Say it to me in other words.
If I were to say that I don't see color, what would you think that I meant by that?
I mean, that sounds like a medical condition.
Well, the reason why I'm saying that is because we say a lot of things, but we don't mean those things literally, right? And I think so when someone says that, as I believe Dr. Sheena Mason was saying earlier, that if you're saying that, it's a phrasing which is not literal. I mean, I don't think anyone can literally say it. Anyone can truly say that, right? So I think in the same way that I would give that benefit of, well, I'll be gracious to a black man saying I don't see color, knowing they're not speaking literally. I would also want to give that grace to a white man when they say that too, right?
Yeah, so I understand that it's not a literal statement, and I'm being a little flippant, Sam. So I mean, if I'm going to be straightforward about it, what I would say is this: I'm no psychologist, right? But for a person of color to say to me, I'm colorblind, I'd want to interrogate them and get at what that means, right? And so, look, if what I've said before has any shot at all at being accurate, there's nothing about something being the expression of a psychological disposition to try to alleviate white liberal guilt that says that only a white person can have that psychological disposition, right? Because another thing that we need to appreciate about racism is that it not only racializes in the sense of marks out populations as the fitting objects of oppression and subjugation, it causes the internalization of that subjugation and that oppression by the people that it so demarcates. Right? So a person can be of the opinion that race, seeing race, being raced is something I should feel guilty about, even when they are the victims of that very social process. And then they might profess things like, I don't see color. Because to say the opposite, to be seeing color, seems to me a more straightforward admission of my complicity in a system that I don't really stand behind.
I think the trouble with that, though, is that speaking of implicit bias, I think that comes with a lot of bias for a lot of the white people that would say that, right? That it would bring in already an accepted view as to what they must mean when they're saying that. And I think it's true that there would be some white people that would say that, right? There's some white people that would want to justify their own racism by saying that. But I think in of itself, the phrasing is already subjective, right? That it could mean anything. Now, I understand, again, because I want to be as a writer, I very much appreciate being very clear and being very specific. So I don't really use colorblind. I wouldn't use that phrase. But I understand that historically, it's only been recently that there's been a lot of pushback against it, and I think rightly so, because I want to celebrate colors, right? I want to celebrate that we have different colors. So I agree with you there. But I think that we make a mistake if, and I see what you're doing, and I appreciate a lot of what you're saying, but I think that we make a mistake if we assume that if a white person is saying this, or that even if most white people are saying this, they're saying it to justify their own racism.
Well, maybe not their own racism, but their complicity in racism, right? I mean, so one may not be overtly engaged in acts that perpetuate a racist regime, but maybe complicit in them. But I would say a couple of other things, Sam, and I'll try to be quick about this, right? So if someone were to say to me that I think of myself as colorblind, the other thing I would say is, well, look, why are you so comfortable with doing violence to meaningful difference, right? Difference that matters to people. Right. So if what I'm saying when I'm colorblind is I treat everybody the same, regardless of any other information that I have about them. Well, why do we suppose that what the correct view is that we should treat everybody the same? Sam, if you and I were running a race and the judge fired the gun and said, Sam, stay on the line, and he let me run 20 yards and then he made me stop and he said, all right, Sam, from here on out, I'm going to treat y'all the same. And he starts the race again. And it's a 100-yard dash. Do you think that you've been treated fairly? Do you think that any meaningful judgments or assessment of the race that transpired between the two of us should fail to account for the fact that I got a 20-yard head start over you? Right. And so what I would say to a colorblind person is, in a society that has a deep and abiding and undeniable history of victimization and the generation of privilege, wealth, political power, as a result of that victimization, what are you really saying to the inheritors of that victimization when you say you don't see the victimization that they've been subjected to?
Mm-hmm. I don't want to own this conversation, but I think just as a reply to that, I think that assumes, well, so one thing actually before I mention this part, if somebody is complicit in racism, then they are guilty of racism, right?
No, I don't want to make that assumption. You're correct to point that out. That would be a faulty assumption to make. Complicity does not make one guilty necessarily.
I would say so, right? That if you are being complicit, if you are allowing for racism, if you are, I mean, I guess it depends on maybe how you want to define the word complicit, right? But I would say if you are approving of it, if you are okay with it, if you are not standing against it, then that means then you are for it as well. If you're not standing against it, you're for it. So if someone's complicit in racism, then they're also then being racist as well too. But that could just be a matter of semantics in many ways. But I think even with your second example about the race, I think that deals with a lot of assumptions too. The reality is, I'm assuming on this panel that not everyone actually agrees that there's. I mean, with your analogy, that would mean that we believe that there is. Forgetting the name, how you phrase the person overseeing the race, that it assumes that we believe that there is right now ongoing systemic racism against Black people in America or in Canada. And not all of us, including myself, would agree with that, right? So there's so many assumptions already at play here that I think we might need to address before we deal with what someone possibly means when they say that they are colorblind.